Hi, I'm Candy Moulton. I'm the author of Chief Joseph, Guardian of the People. I became interested in the story of Chief Joseph many years before I actually started writing about him, and partially because I was able to go on a backcountry trip into Yellowstone National Park in 1990, which was 2 years after the big fires up in Yellowstone, and we rode up through the Lamar Valley and camped. I was with an outfitter out of Cody, Wyoming, on a trip actually sponsored by Wyoming Tourism. And we went in for about a week and camped, and it was just a wonderful time in Yellowstone. We decided we needed to ride out the last day, and we came out over Mist Creek Pass. And I knew that Mist Creek Pass was the pass that Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce had followed in 1877 when they were traveling through Yellowstone. On their way, they were headed north at that time. And so it was pretty interesting and fun to ride through there. It was raining that day. The trees had started to die, the roots had started to die after the fires. And so as we rode, it was misty and it was raining. It was very quiet in the forest, except that you could hear trees falling all around you as you rode. And so it was just a nice time to go through there. And like I say, I knew that that was the route that Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce had taken. And we went on out through the Pelican Valley, and we came out in the rain. We were pretty wet by the time we got out to the trailhead. And then years went by after that, and I was writing a lot of stories for True West and other magazines, and I was able to travel quite a bit with Montana Travel up in Montana, and went to the site of the Bear Paw battle where Chief Joseph surrendered. I went to the Big Hole battlefield where they'd had a fight in August of 1877. So I had traveled a lot of the trail and been on the ground, and got to see the places where so many important events happened in that Nez Perce story. And many years passed again, and I had a call one day from Dale Walker, who was a great writer and editor in El Paso, Texas, and he asked me if I would write a book about Chief Joseph for a new series that Forge was publishing called American Heroes. And I told him I couldn't because I was too busy. And he called me back a few days later, and I said, I don't think I can do it because I'm pretty busy. I've got some other things to do. And we talked and we hung up, and about 3 days later he called me back, and I said, oh, I want to do this story so bad. So I actually did the book. And I didn't have a long time to research and write that book, but I was able to do it because I had already traveled so much of the trail. The one place I had not been, though, which is very important, obviously, to the Chief Joseph story, was the Wallowa Valley out in Oregon. So we got in the car, my husband and I, and we drove out to Oregon. We took our tent and our bedrolls, and we went to Oregon. We went to the Wallowa Valley. I'd never been there before. I had no idea what that country was like. I was rather amazed by it. It's big grass country, but just very steep hills. And the one place I really wanted to go, by then I had done a lot more research, and I knew that when the Nez Perce left that valley, their homeland, in 1877, they had traveled, and it was late May, it was during flood stage, and they had to cross the Snake River. Now when they left, it was the entire tribe. It was, grandmothers and grandfathers, parents, children, all of their livestock, everything that they owned that they were able to take with them. And so I wanted to see where they crossed the river and what that river would have been like, knowing even today that there are dams and other things that affect it. So we went to the Wallowa Valley, and I asked about directions to get to a place called Dug Bar, which is where they crossed the river, where they crossed the Snake. And a guy at a gas station told me how to go, and I started down this not very good road in my Subaru, and I decided I couldn't do it. I was afraid to get down there and that I'd get stuck or something and wouldn't be able to get out. So I decided that we'd go on the river to Dug Bar, and I don't like rivers at all. I really don't like being on big water. And so we went back to Lewiston, Idaho, and they had some jet boat trips that would take you up the Snake to Dug Bar. So we got on a jet boat, and I wore my life jacket. No one else did, but I did. And we went to where the Nez Perce crossed the river, and it's a really special place because they lost a lot of livestock that day, but they didn't lose any people because the Nez Perce were very used to crossing rivers, and they knew how to do it. And they would put the older people and the babies on horses and get them across, and the men would basically just strip down and they'd swim with the horses and with the livestock and the families. And so it's just amazing to think how they took everyone across that river in flood stage into May 1877. And then we went to Whitebird Canyon and most of the other places along the trail. We camped up on a hillside somewhere in Idaho where they'd had some of their encounters. And so it was really important to me to camp and not stay in motels on that trip, because I really wanted to feel the land, and I wanted to feel how the people, when they had to make that trip, how that would have been for them. I've not ridden nor walked across Wallowa Pass, which is the one real important place to their travels. That I've driven the Highway 12, but I've not ridden across that. So for me, in doing any kind of writing, I want to see where the people were, see where the story was set. I want to try to feel the place a bit. That's part of writing, and that's part of putting the real story there, because in all the work that I've done and all the research and all the writing that I've done, I know that while a lot of things have changed in 100, 150 years, the one thing that hasn't changed very much is the land. And the other thing that changes all the time but is non-controllable is the weather. And so if it's raining, if it's windy, if it's snowing, if it's cold, those are the kinds of conditions that they would have gone through in their trip. And those are the kinds of things that they couldn't control either. So I think there are a lot of really special places along the Nez Perce Trail. Clearly the Wallowa Valley is a very special place. That's where Chief Joseph grew up. His brother Olcott, who was actually the war chief. Chief Joseph was the peace chief, the guardian chief. He was never the war leader. He was accorded by the press during the time as being the supreme leader of the Nez Perce, but he wasn't. He was one of several headmen who directed the travel, took care of the people, and did that long journey over 1,500 miles from Idaho, crossed into Montana, back down into Idaho, through Yellowstone National Park, and then back into Montana, heading toward Canada. When they went through Yellowstone, it's a really important part of the journey. First of all, because no one expected them to go in Yellowstone. And they went into the park, and almost immediately when they got in the park, Yellow Wolf, who was one of the scouts working with Chief Joseph, and he was a cousin of Joseph, he and some of the other scouts came across a tourist party in there, the Cowan party, and they captured these tourists. And this other gentleman who was a miner, who just happened to be in the park at the same time. And they thought that this miner, John Shively, could lead them through the park because they didn't really know the park very well. And they thought he might be able to lead them. And they took the Cowans as hostages for no reason really that's discernible, other than that they were in the way. And it was a brother, two sisters, and the one sister's husband, George Cowan and Emma Cowan. And they went through the park. They took these hostages and they started through the park. And what happened, they let everyone go, or they escaped. Some of them just escaped, but they finally let the three Cowan siblings go, and they went north up toward Mammoth. They weren't harmed at all. George Cowan was, Emma's husband, was harmed, but he survived. But what happened was they then knew, the Cowan siblings knew what was going on in the camps. They knew who the leaders were, they knew how many children there were, they knew how many elders there were, they knew the condition of their horses, they knew the direction that they were traveling. So they provided a lot of intelligence when they came out, and they talked to the press and etc. But what it really did, interestingly, is it really just fueled a lot of sympathy for the Nez Perce, that they were being chased by this large army directed by General Oliver O. Howard. who had been following them all the way from Idaho. They came out of Yellowstone and they were headed north. They had intended to go to the Crow country because they thought that the Crows would help them. By the time they got into Yellowstone, they realized, though, that the Crows were allies of the military and would not be any assistance to the Nez Perce. So they came out of Yellowstone, and everyone thought they would just go north out of Yellowstone. And instead, they went over Mist Creek Pass, through the Pelican Valley, over Mist Creek Pass, followed the Lamar River, went into the Clarks Fork River, and everyone then thought they were going to turn south toward Cody, Wyoming, through the Sunlight Basin. No one thought that they would go the way that they did, which was right up the Clarks Fork and through the Clarks Fork Canyon, which is a very rugged area in northern Wyoming. And they went back into Montana then, and then they just really headed due north. And by then they decided they had to go to Canada. They were going to join Sitting Bull. And they slowed their travel when they got closer to the Canadian border. And the Army had another contingent that came in, General Miles, and he came in from the east. And when he came in, they didn't know he was there at all. So when he came in from the east, they had stopped at the Big Hole near Chinook, Montana, and they stopped there, and that next day then Miles basically surrounded them and they had a battle. They went into a siege and they were there for 4 days before Chief Joseph finally surrendered. All this time, Chief Joseph was, I call him the guardian of the people. He was taking care of the families. When they got attacked at the Big Hole in August, on August 9th, when they were attacked in the early morning, the scouts and the young warriors all held off the army that was led by John Gibbon, Colonel John Gibbon. And Joseph rounded up literally the people, and he took them away from the camp. And so every time that was his role. His role was to take care of the families and get them away. When they were at the Big Hole, when they were at the Bear's Paw, all of the leaders had been killed except Whitebird and Joseph, and Whitebird wanted to go to Canada. And they decided, as was very traditional in Indian times and even today, an Indian can make his or her own decision about what is right for them. And so Whitebird decided he was going to go to Canada, and a lot of people followed him, including some of Joseph's closest family members. His daughter ended up with Whitebird. His 12-year-old daughter ended up with Whitebird in Canada. And Joseph surrendered, and when he gave his gun up, he said he would fight no more forever. That's the famous line that he uttered, or at least was transcribed as him saying that. And then he took the people, and he said in his writings later that he did it because he knew he could have escaped, and some of the people with him could have escaped, but so many of the people were elderly or injured that he felt it was important to stay together and he would take care of them. And so even though he said he would fight no more forever, they surrendered, and they were taken down to Fort Keogh in Montana, and then to Bismarck, Fort Lincoln in Bismarck, North Dakota, eventually down the Missouri, clear to Fort Leavenworth, and into Baxter Springs, Kansas, into Indian country, Indian territory, which is Oklahoma, where many of the people died. And it was the wrong kind of climate for them. It was hot, it was humid, it had germs that they weren't used to. But Joseph, who'd said he would fight no more forever, immediately began fighting in a different way, and that was through diplomacy. And he went to Washington, D.C. He was able to garner support from a lot of Christian organizations and Indian rights activists. And so finally he was able to bring his people back to the Pacific Northwest, but they never went back to the Wallowa Valley. They did not go to Idaho. They instead went to Washington State and at Nez Perce, which is the Colville Indian Reservation, where he later died, and that's where he's buried alongside of Yellow Wolf, who was his nephew. We have the best stories of the Nez Perce view of the whole story of the Nez Perce War from Yellow Wolf, who recited and told his tale of that whole events in 1877 to Lucius McWhorter. And Yellow Wolf's story is very, very important because it really chronicles how the Indians felt and what they were going through during that time. As I was working on my research and writing my book, the one thing that I used a lot were photographs and ledger drawings that I was able to find, because they gave the image from the Indian perspective. Not photographs of the Indian camp, there are none that I know of, but one photograph in particular was a photograph of Joseph, Chief Joseph, that was taken at Fort Keogh in Montana after he had surrendered, and it shows him, you can tell he was young and strong and vibrant, and yet very tired, very weary looking. His hands are just all scratched and scraped, and you can just tell that he's someone who's been living outside and you know, working with horses and working with all the kinds of things that you have in the outdoors. It's a really, really powerful picture and image of him. It's not the image that you see the most. You see other images of him with big war bonnets on and things like that that weren't Joseph at all. He never wore that kind of thing. So it's a great story to tell. It's a very emotional story. It's a story that many writers have told long before I did and even after I wrote my book. People will continue to return to the story of the Nez Perce because it's a story of a people and how they really just wanted to live in their own home country. And they didn't want to be forced onto a reservation, but they were, as many other Indian tribes were during that whole same time. For me, there's a very interesting connection between Chief Joseph and Crazy Horse. In 1876, of course, was the Battle of Little Bighorn up in Montana, where Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull fought and defeated Custer and his troops. All of that had a lot to do with what happened with the Nez Perce, because they were then, the military and the government position was that the tribes and the Indians needed to be corralled, put in Indian territory or onto reservations. They didn't want these free-roaming, free-ranging Indian tribes anymore. And in 1877, in that fall period, when Joseph is going through Yellowstone and then heading north across Montana, Crazy Horse had surrendered in May at the same time that Joseph left his homeland. And Crazy Horse was in a camp near Camp Robinson in that fall. And so right at the same time that Joseph's trying to remain free, Crazy Horse is also trying to remain free. And Crazy Horse was asked to go and help look for the Nez Perce. And there are two sides to the story, and one side of the story is that he said he would go. But the interpretation of that, the interpreter, didn't interpret it that way. And he said that he would go and he would fight, but meaning he would fight the military. And so then the military arrested Crazy Horse, took him to Camp Robinson, and he was stabbed and killed there in September of 1877. So all of that just ties together. Even though those two men never met each other, there's never any direct connection, their stories are really entwined. And I like that. The big stories of the West, there are all these interconnections, and when you follow one lead and it takes you to another one, and I love writing about those kinds of stories.